Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth of our digital talks coming to you from Now Gallery. This evening I'll be speaking to artist-curators Rochelle White and Georgina Johnson on the concept of slowness. And both Georgina and Rochelle have worked together to create an amazing digital download that accompanies the talk. So I thought, welcome Rochelle and Georgina.
Hi.
Hi. I thought I'd just kind of introduce what you do. You both kind of work on, social engagement projects. You look at, the Black identity, and you also have created spaces for emerging practitioners. So it would be good to kind of, look at that, as we unpack this idea of slowness. But I wanted to introduce everybody and give them a flavor to the kind of work that you do. I've had the pleasure of both, working with both of you. You've done some really amazing collaborations. Georgina, you've worked with us. You've, done commissions for the National Museums of Scotland. Rochelle, you've worked with the Tate and Bold Tendencies, but you've both created these curatorial platforms, and wanted to just share a little bit about your work. So this is a collaboration between Georgina, also known as St. Lovey, and adamant back in 2018. And it was part of the Another England exhibition, which Now Gallery, created in collaboration with Historic England. And it looked at, a snapshot of Black and Asian heritage in the UK, through the lens of photography. And there was a particular section where we asked young photographers to answer to the provocation of Another England. So Georgina, would you mind just telling us a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, sure. Well, this image in particular is called Black Waves. And so it's a collaboration between me and my dear friend, Adamant. And we basically were looking at the commodification of the Black body, more so in popular culture, and how Black flesh is lusted over, wanted, desired for. But ultimately, there's a huge chasm between how we are represented and how we feel we should be represented. And I felt like, well, this project kind of gave us an opportunity to peel it all back, really, and to think about softness and to think about mental health and the impacts of the commodification of our body on our mental health and our well-being. And that resulted in a series of images that were hung in the gallery that I guess you guys have, and a zine that we gave out for free. I think we made 100 amount for a night, and I love the zine and I love the series, and it was an incredible project to work with on Adama with, because I got to cast like my cousin and her newborn baby and her second youngest daughter, and it was just really beautiful. I kind of feel like whenever I do these projects, they're just equally cathartic, but also kind of push me into a new way of working and exploring things, because I wouldn't consider myself a photographer. I would just say that I'm a storyteller. So in working through collaboration and working with friends, I'm able to just flesh that out and let it take whichever form it can, because I don't really believe in like containing creativity to like one medium. So it's exciting in this format to experiment with poetry and text and create a zine and then give that out for free, because I want to make sure art is accessible as well. It's not just about going into a gallery and seeing the work and not feeling you can touch it. You can have something that you can take home as well. And I think it's really important in terms of us having ownership of our own stories as well.
Yeah, so it was really, really powerful image, because it captured women of all ages, I think, and it just felt really powerful. So I'll just share really briefly a piece from Rochelle called Brother Will. Can I just check? Is this your grandfather?
Yeah, this is my granddad, and he is now 85. I just spoke to him on the phone today. So yeah, this features my granddad. Very true.
Yeah, thank God that you getting more work.
Yes,
And in your field, you are getting some work, and you're happy about it.
Yeah.
You're not sitting in the office, you're up and down.
Yeah, this is it.
And
I feel
you
good
still
about
do
that.
a bit with your mom.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank the Lord.
So it's a good balance right now.
You see,
for
thank
me.
the Lord. That's good news.
Thank
I'm
you.
praying for you. I'm caring for you. And God is God. He help us.
Yeah.
He's merciful unto us. And grace fall from parents to grandparents to children, and from grandparents to grandchildren, and that, and grace pass on.
Yeah.
God hear and answer prayer.
Having that open door policy with parents is so important, and it did a lot for me growing up. Being able to live with my grandparents. It's a very special thing.
Well, I don't know if you remember it, but
some memories, just various memories, but I just remember having that extra teachment from both of you in the house.
And use them
every now.
So it just is such a kind of tender, intimate exchange between you two. And I feel like all the material culture that's been expressed within that interior is really familiar, you know, to a lot of people from Afro-Caribbean heritage. Just could you tell us a little bit more about the piece?
Yeah, so my granddad has been a real pillar in our family. When my grandma passed away about 12 years ago, it was just a real kind of sudden disruption in the family dynamic. And through the loss of her, I realized that, you know, that generation is passing on. And with that happening, they are also holding on to stories, like really amazing gems about where they grew up, how they grew up, the kind of core values that they've instilled within the rest of the family. And so I just wanted to really hone in on this story, and also just kind of create a really beautiful portrait of my granddad as he is. He didn't even really understand too tough like what I was doing. He just knows I'm there with the camera, and he just carries on. But it was just very sweet to be able to go through that process with him of making and collaborating in a sense. And the fact that he trusted me with his kind of story and portrait was really beautiful as well. So it's a very personal piece for me, but I'm also really grateful that it can resonate with so many people on various levels. So yeah.
Great. Well, we're going to get into the idea of slowness and explore it. So this is a brilliant document, I felt. It's like a toolkit for what we are, you know, to help us kind of navigate what we're going through right now. It has so many useful kind of bits of content and quotes. And I hope it really helps us frame tonight's conversation. I wanted to really start by kind of, you know, the definition of slowness, or the slow movement. I know that, you know, protagonists like Carl Honoré, he kind of, you know, the switch to this idea of slowness came after moments of crisis. And it feels like very relevant that we're discussing this now, where we're questioning everything and we are actually being asked to slow down. So could both of you kind of help with this definition, because, you know, it can be applied to slow fashion, slow photography, you know, it does permeate a lot of different layers. But for you, and for the purpose of tonight's discussion, what does slowness mean to you? On a personal and artistic kind of level.
Got it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so slowness, I feel...
Just one thing, can you see the screen now?
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, we can.
Let's carry on. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that I think slowness is a refuting of not only pace, but it's also ideologies, and choosing to unlearn things and be intentional with your actions. I mean, I think within this crisis, we're having so many conversations about what constitutes as normal. And I often think about, well, what if what we were used to as being normal wasn't actually normal? And I think in a lot of ways it wasn't, because for a lot of people, there was so much suffering, for instance, and for us to kind of go back to what we are comfortable with, it's still it still results in a lot of suffering for a lot of people. So I think slowness essentially is refuting capitalism, and it's instead embracing this ideology of like radical optimism, radical compassion, and radical care. And I love the quote that Tina Kant says about it being a bridge for us to recognize other capacities, because I think if we're not introduced to other ways of thinking, and I do feel like a journey anywhere kind of starts with something coming in your mind and you deciding like, am I going to follow this, or am I going to keep going and stay in what I know, you know? So capacities, and like we have to stretch ourselves to go beyond normalcy, and try and strive for more.
For sure.
Yeah, this oh, sorry, Rochelle, you.
No, it's cool. I was just going to say that, you know, I've had many conversations with Georgina about the way that we work. You know, is it sustainable? Is it kind? Is it kind to ourselves? Is it kind to others? And also, are we internalizing like capitalism pressures to churn out work in a sort of like factory kind of way? And I think where so many of us are kind of institutionalized in regards to like our education, many of us went to art school, many of us have worked with various museums and institutions, I think we need to kind of unpack some kind of, I don't know, like pattern or model in terms of how we work with these places and how we see ourselves within these places, but also within the wider society. And so I've really admired the idea of slowness, and this time has really called for kind of reflection, and also for us to look at the vulnerabilities that maybe we've been avoiding because of how fast-paced everything has been prior. So we're really, I think, in a kind of transformative moment, which is why when Gigi mentioned slowness as a bridge, a quote from the talk with Tina Kant, I just felt that it was so fitting for this time, because I really feel like we're on a bridge. We're really figuring out
what's next,
the way that we've worked and the ways that we'd like to work moving forward collectively, hopefully.
Yeah, and that's where I think it comes into it not necessarily being a question of kinetics, because there is always going to be some sort of action in your body, because whether or not you're thinking, your body reacts in some way. But I feel as though it's not necessarily about busying ourselves or busying our bodies and then saying, right, I'm going to be slow, so let me do this campaign or think about doing work in another way. Like exactly doing those things, it still internalizes capitalism, and it makes you busy yourself, you know. I don't think it means stop working, and I don't think it means be static, but I do think it means being more intentional and thinking about how your actions impact other people, and like this super fragile interconnectedness between living things, you know. So I mean, I love this talk so much.
Yeah, definitely. I think definitely it's that about meaningful connections, and I feel like, you know, often we haven't really kind of slowed down enough to communicate. So this discussion there were so many, you know, I really encourage everyone to kind of go back to this and listen to the whole discourse. But they kind of identify salient values that we should be working towards as kind of kinship, community, and care. And I feel that that's really relevant to artists, but I just think across the you know, across the board. These should be values that are kind of, you know, at the core. And, you know, how are you, in your practices, are you contemplating ideas around kinship and care?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that after kind of graduating uni and having such a kind of isolated experience, I was able to connect with so many other people who had also felt that isolation through formal arts education, or just formal education in general, or having encountered walking into a museum that didn't feel welcoming, or again having experiences with police and things like that. So institutions in general. So I think through these shared and common kind of experiences, we've been able to connect. So East It's a platform, Eating at the Same Table, a platform that was started in 2017 by myself and Sasha Morgan, who is the Director of Education at Bold Tendencies. It is now led by myself and Hamid Maya, who's a fantastic multidisciplinary artist. We came together and really just started to share experiences and find that kind of kinship, but also like a real deep kind of companionship and friendship and support system as we navigate these kinds of spaces. So yeah, that's kind of how we've tried to embed care in the way that we work, even from kind of the sensitivity to language and the way that we communicate, creating modes of kind of reference points for communications and scripts which happen with galleries that we work with, institutions that we work with, ways that we can kind of flatten the hierarchy in a way and kind of democratize art so that it can be wider and more available and accessible to a broader audience, which also includes just like breaking down the kind of academic jargon that we see so often in texts and in lectures and things like that. So where we strive to create alternative modes of education for people, we really pay attention to the kind of embedded hierarchies within education and within the kind of transference or sharing or exchanging of knowledge and experiences. So I think care is at the heart and root of everything that we do with East, for sure.
Yeah,
Great.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Rush is saying. But I feel as though we have to also consider what care means to different communities, because we're both Caribbean, me and Rochelle, and I'm sure care to us as are you, Kaia.
And you.
But I'm sure care and how care manifests itself in our communities, in our homes, in our culture is very different to how it manifests itself in a culture on mainland Europe or whatever. So we also have to think about, is there slack in the containment of care and how care is defined, essentially, if we are moving towards slowness, right? Is there slack within this definition, or is there capacity within this definition for there to be some movement so that we're not holding on so much to what we define necessarily, but we can actually adopt other things and other principles, and in that way it becomes a democratic space, because community makers are trying to be democratic because we're carving out spaces that didn't exist to us and aren't available to us, for instance. So that is a mode of care, right? But if you look in other communities where they've been doing this in different modes for centuries and era, I feel as though if we start democratizing the space and like deciding we might have conversations with this person over here and this person over here, that in itself is an act of care, because it's opening up the containment of care. So
yeah, but also how we can roll out what we've learned from how different communities approach the idea of care to help the greater collective kind of good, basically. I think there's definitely room for that, and this is definitely the time to kind of start to rethink how we approach all of these values. I guess we should touch on a little bit about, the inequalities that have been revealed, here in the US and the UK. In this talk as well, there's a really, really valid point that the idea of slowness might be somewhat flawed, and I wanted you guys to comment on that, because there seems to be a tension between ourselves kind of slowing down and, the whole modality of that, compared to people in the front line who obviously have not been able to, and who are kind of always on and always working and haven't had the opportunity to do so. So, or options. How do you feel? I mean, I think it's just revealed so many fissures. How do you feel about that?
It's really sad, and it's unfathomable, to be honest. Like, even hearing the news today about like the easing of lockdown and I was filled with anxiety pretty much straight away, because
definitely
whilst I understand that life, like for many, has to go on in some type of way and looking some type of way, it just feels as though there's still this unknown, foreboding thing. You know, we can't see it a lot of the time, you know, but we know that it's present. And it feels as though like the sacrifice on the sacrifice on display, you know, people, and namely people of color, people from working class backgrounds, people that have for a long time been considered disposable to society,
right.
Also, you know, now putting themselves in the front. And I don't know, man, like it's incredibly scary. And again, it just reveals the truth of capitalism, that you must go out to work because you are essential to us keeping our economy going, right? So it goes back to the health of capital, right? Not the health of people. So it's really scary.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting to understand this idea of capitalism being a self-defeating engine. But I think it's really never straightforward. So I think it definitely needs us to kind of unpack it more. But I think, yeah, it is something that has definitely come to the fore.
Absolutely.
I guess your point, Kaia, about slowness being a bit of a challenge, or it being redundant in some sense, it still goes back to like the quote at the beginning of it not necessarily being a question of kinetics, and also being a question of like unlearning, and like how those ideologies or those principles or those measures of practice kind of infiltrate systems, and if kind of adopted, what does that look like, you know? So
I think that's a really good point. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just think in regards to like slowness as well, I think what's become really prominent for me is kind of seeing scripts about people being able to center themselves, become more aligned during this time, do more reading, do more exercising, things like that. I think in regards to slowness, we have to think about who is awarded slowness and who is it a luxury for, and who cannot access slowness because they're being called to the front line, and because their situations which are already compromised are accelerated by this crisis that has happened. A really interesting point that I think it was it Sadia in the talk with Tina Kemp, she said that something about being forced into non-stopness and slowness simultaneously. So there's like this kind of pressure of this engine of capitalism kind of calling for us to do more live talks, or do more kind of calls or chats, or create some amazing piece of work during this time. But then at the same time, is that practical? I don't know if that works in regards to if we are really being slow. Again, Gigi, like as you said, what does that look like? You know, what does that look like?
I think we can view it through a lens of business. We can't view it through a lens of politics as we know it. We have to like really start breaking these things down and thinking about what demands we kind of want to make for ourselves, for the future community, for our future industries, right? So it is about really thinking like what is necessary, and do my needs encroach on the needs of somebody else, and what is that intention, and like what is connected, you know? Because the needs of the state, which is to get TFL running, encroaches on the needs of somebody at home who has to feed their child, but is now putting themselves in the way of damage, or putting their health in danger. So yeah, it's I don't know like how we get to the bottom of it, but I do think it is about reimagining this whole thing, and it's a huge feat.
It's at the start. You know, and there's, in terms of productivity in this time, there is that, especially when you look at it from an artist's point of view or cultural platforms point of view, you may want to see it as it's a time to really kind of reflect and be introspective. But also it is you wanting to keep the dialogue kind of going as well. So it's many things.
It's a tricky one. It is.
Tricky one.
It is. But we're trying to find
like
ways.
the mechanization of bodies, right? Whereas artists even feel as, well, a lot of artists do feel their value placed in productivity.
Yeah.
And I think like challenging that notion is actually adopting slowness and deciding that you're going to sit with your thoughts and they're going to be yours. Like thinking is work, you know, creating this document is work. Like it's also about completely redefining what these are, you know. It doesn't have to be a film, it doesn't have to be ceramics, it can literally be a word on paper, and that's it, because you put yourself into it, you know.
Yeah.
But also, doesn't it speak, like, in terms of, if we're looking at it from an artistic perspective, how art is consumed now, or has been before the lockdown, is just at such a rapid rate. You know, perhaps it's almost like you have to keep producing things, and I don't know how you feel about that, because it's also about the demand for visual stimulation as well.
That's it. I think I took a real stance a few years ago, and again, like Georgina and I have had conversations about this, and I've had conversations about slowing down with various artists who have felt the pressure to really just churn out the work. But then I feel like that contributes to the kind of oversaturation of kind of content and stuff these days that is just overloading us. I think everyone can kind of agree that their dreams have been significantly more vivid in this time because of the overloads of like content. It's just stimulating, just like you're just buzzing constantly. And I think even in regards to just creating,
we were talking about this the other day.
It's mad. It's actually too much. Like there's just so many things happening in my dream. It's too much. But in regards to just this overstimulation, I think I had to just take myself out and say, hold on a second, like I'm creating work that I don't even like just because of this pressure to be productive, which is where I'm just like, you have to stay true to yourself and to your timing and your pace, because if not, you don't put out the work that you're best proud of, you don't put out work that's authentic. And then I think also that can be felt. I think that can be felt by the people who are viewing the work, you know? So I think we as curators as well in our team, we're also we're kind of breathing a sigh of relief in a way that we've got a bit more time to really fully form and shape our ideas and you know, look at all sorts of, you know, different ways of bringing you know, content to people. So it's been a really interesting time. For sure.
So you wanted to show a video. Do I just click on here?
Yeah, it's just the middle image.
This one here.
Yeah, that's the one.
Brilliant.
That should lead you to a Vimeo link.
Presence and back roads, hot stepping on concrete. Remembering God's got my feet. Finally grounded now, but I don't know what to do in it, cause there's no more water to wade through. Do I gotta grant God back a little peace? Or God must keep on suffering too? Love me same way how anything I do, God gotta go through too. Dear God.
Right, I might stop it there.
Yeah, that's perfect.
It's brilliant.
So this is a piece called Roadworks, which was released last year in response to a Lebanese Persian artist called Mona Hatoum. She created the original piece in 1985. And so I was kind of creating a response to that video 34 years later. A lot of the themes that she explored were solidarity to, well, showing her solidarity through performance with the Black community who were dealing with police brutality and gentrification in Brixton. And that performance piece followed my journey from Brixton to Peckham bus garage. So in a way, I was kind of responding to the fact that many of the things are the same, many of the issues and experiences that we as a Black community face are the same. Stop and search is rife right now, and it has so many ripples throughout the whole community. But also I was looking and kind of studying the role of a Black woman in the inner city, and in and amongst institutions. A lot of the time we are rendered invisible but also hyper visible at the same time. So I was kind of trying to navigate this way of moving but also working in a really slow, methodical way in that performance. So speaking of slowness, that was definitely a real kind of test for me. But the piece also became a lament in a way for so many of the people who had lost their lives to brutality or to injustices, austerity. It goes on, but you can see the whole piece on the link as well. So yeah, that's Roadworks.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
There's so much to get through in this document, and I'm aware we don't have loads and loads of time, but I wanted to definitely touch on this idea that's in here about micro perceptions. And I wanted you to kind of both kind of go into it a bit more and, you know, expand on what that is, because that feels quite important.
Yeah,
I was, after our chat earlier, I was thinking more so about it. And in the doc, you can see the definition by Brian Masumi, but he takes this theory from philosopher and psychoanalyst Losing Guattari. And he's basically saying that there's an activation. I mean, you can see this in the PDF that's linked in the doc as well. But there's some pieces that I've grabbed from the PDF that I think are really interesting. So in breaking down the theory of a microperception, he says that there's an activation not only of the body, but of the body's tendencies. So as they move through different situations. So the micro is essentially something happening on the individual or on a communal level. And he goes on to say, because no human being starts without any presuppositions. So I think this connects quite deeply to everything that we're kind of unpacking about slowness as a challenge and slowness as something that maybe we feel in this current situation isn't possible to adopt because of the way things are currently. But he's saying that because of these micro shocks that are happening every day of our lives, the only way that a change in movement or a change in philosophy or a change in principle can happen is when you start owning feelings, thoughts, patterns, behaviors, and that happens on like the macro level. So when governments do that, when groups do that, essentially. So that is slowness, when you accept the challenge to regenerate your terms, think about the cohesion and their cohesion to each other. So everything is repeated and we kind of live in a series of repetitions in our own bodies. And that can happen on a huge level or on a small level, you know, because everything is kind of interrupting us or we're waiting for an interruption. So that's what he considers a micro-perception. And in relaying that to Tina Campt and what she says about it not necessarily being bodily, he then says that it's purely effective. It's purely an effective re-beginning of the world. And it is bodily, because there is no effect, or nothing can necessarily happen without an accompanying movement of your body or your mind, and that then triggers. So one way it's not, I think when they're talking about kinetics, because they're also citing the choreographer, so he's not talking about kinetics in terms of heavy movement and mass movement, but if we are addressing or adopting the idea of a micro-perception, it is about bodily movement via your mind, kind of putting that into place or starting that motion.
Great.
Yeah, no, that's really true. I think, yeah, in regards to movement, I think that's something that a lot of us take for granted, just the sense of kind of being able to expel feelings and stresses and traumas through movement. So many of us kind of move through the day and don't even realize that our shoulders are right by our ears, and it's kind of like releasing that tension is so important. And also just, yeah, in regards to hereditary kind of trauma, I think so much of that is kind of built upon some of the past traumas that those who came before us were dealing with. And I think so many of us have not yet looked at that, and may not be able to actually for a long time. So
it's in your muscle memory.
slowness is key for that. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, some people might think that that's quite key to survival in a way. You know?
Yeah, for sure.
100%.
People create, support structures that work for them, and coping mechanisms that have worked for them. So I think when we are kind of creating new modes for coping, we have to go slow, because destabilizing that could be potentially disastrous. I think we definitely have to go at our own pace with these kinds of things. But Georgina introducing me to micro-perceptions has really just kind of been able to put language on some of the things that I've been feeling, and some of the things that I can recognize in other people, in my family, in friends. So I think finding language is a great tool to help us identify what we're feeling,
In this time, like the anticipation of grief, or the anticipation of anxiety, like if we go back to the start of the conversation, talking about the lowering of lockdown, for instance, you anticipate fear.
Yeah, for sure.
Your safety being encroached upon. But then if you also think about like slowness and what we're talking about adopting that model, for so many people, that's their life in general, that their fear is going to be encroached, that their life is going to be encroached upon, their safety is going to be encroached upon, and
there seems to be a distrust that's kind of come out of this whole.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. Especially in regards to touch and things like that. We are such tangible kinds of people, I think, in society, but also in communities such as like the Caribbean community. I know that we're so tactile and touchy-feely, and that's just so strange to kind of come to terms with the fact that moving around in society now is going to be so different, and also there's going to be a kind of unlearning or a retrusting that takes place after this, in regards to touch,
Yeah. I mean, I know we're going back to Tina Camp again, but it just had so many valid points.
Yeah.
She says in the, with where we have this now physical chasm and this lack of physicality, that actually voices and listening and audio become really important. So, and I know that you obviously employ that a lot in your work anyway, but I wanted us to touch on community as a key, this point of, a constellation of mobilizers that you mention here, and especially at grassroots. And I wondered which arts collectives do you really feel, they're doing kind of great work and you admire. And I also wanted you to kind of talk a little bit about your individual curation platforms and the work that you've been doing.
Yeah. I feel like as individuals, like a friend of mine, Devin, in New York, is just somebody that Devin N. Morris, is an artist, and somebody that I think about, that I feel automatic joy about, automatic warmth, and I think when like needs like, and you kind of just orient towards people that feel like the sun, And I feel that way about Rochelle as well. And I think that's kind of why we found each other and we work together.
For sure.
But that is the vibration, that is the constellation, you know, that people just dipping in and connecting you to other people, and then that creates this incredible energy, you know. And I think like it's not something to tap into in terms of, okay, what can I gain from this person? But simply by being by them makes you feel incredible, and you can have an incredible conversation, and then that changes into something else. And I think a lot of the platforms that we're starting, they start from conversations. They start from us feeling out of place. They start by us wanting to make things better, you know. And in some way, before we even knew that we were being slow, we adopted this because we were executing capitalism, because we have to, because it doesn't work for us. And that's the whole point of capitalism. It engulfs bodies. It is this nebulizing entity. It just eats itself, you know. And we don't want to be a part of that. We want to feed and we want to nourish. And that does, I think, start with understanding what we also need. And many a conversation that me and Rochelle have are about simply asking the question, are you really okay? Like, what do you need? Let me take the time, you know? And I think that's what community makers of the future need to be asking constantly. Like, it's great, it's brilliant to feed lots of people, but you also have to think about yourself, and you, not in an individualistic sense, but in a sense of preservation. Because who knows what our future spaces are going to look like if we're going to be able to gather, because that has been completely changed and channeled in this crisis. So what is the community now? And like you said, maybe it is sounds and audio and the visual, but I also think touch is incredibly important.
Very important, yeah.
That's one thing I've been thinking about as well in regards to just both of our platforms and the way that we work just as individuals. The lack of physicality now has really kind of changed the way that we identify and relate with one another as well. The fact that we can't lean into one another, the fact that we can't hold hands or hug or kiss on the cheek or anything like that is just really changing the way that we work. And I think that's why we flagged socially engaged practice on this document as well, because so much of our work is about process, collaboration, relationship building and nurturing. And it's not necessarily about a finished, shiny outcome. It's more about the process, the experience and the transformation of it, I think, or the transformative potential of getting together and creating over time with valued individuals, you know. To find new ways.
I just wanted to remind everybody that they can submit questions via the chat. So we'll be going to those questions shortly. But I wanted to kind of end, I know Georgina is going to read a short excerpt, but I wanted to ask you both what you're hoping people will take away from this whole exercise.
Well,
I think it's a hard one. Like, I think it would be really, as I said earlier, a bit romantic to kind of want people to kind of come away with these totally new ways of working or ways of approaching, unpacking, you know, anything during this time. But I hope that people can at least start to think about the ways that we relate to work, our bodies, how we represent in the community, our positionality. I think I'd like people to ask themselves if they're truly okay more, I think especially considering the ways that we've worked prior to this collectively. It's been so much of going to a kind of autopilot answer as to like, are we okay, or questions of how we're doing today and things like that. So I think what I would like is for people to just think about the way that we're approaching, and whether it can be more holistic, whether we can think more about ourselves in relation to our mind and our bodies and what's inside if you are a spiritual person. So I think that's what I'd like for people to start thinking about, but also finding ways together, because I am by no means somebody who can kind of impart this knowledge onto anybody. I think it needs to be an exchange. So I'd love for the conversation to continue after this, you know. So yeah.
I think, like, on the last point, instead of reading a poem, I wanted to read an extract from this book, What's Love, Care, Intimacy or Warmth Got to Do with It, from Eflux Journal and Sternberg Press. But there's the PDF of the particular article that I'm going to read in the document, and it's the exhaustion and exuberance, ways to defy the pressure to perform. So it's talking about latency, so the state of existing but not yet being developed. So talking about slowness essentially as something that there's potential to develop. Another mode of performing the I can't in the key of the I can that art and poetry have always used to great effect is to create moments in which meaning remains provocatively latent. To embrace latency goes against the grain of the logic of high performance. The appraisal of latency restores dignity to the unsaid, the unshown, and everything that can't be dragged out into the open in the rush of high performance, when the value of all our potentials appears to depend entirely on our capacity to actualize them right here or right now. The fatal sequence of this continuous pressure to perform is the exhaustion of all our potentials, precisely because the current social order denies the value of latency, the value of potentiality that remains presently unactualized and quite possibly can't ever be exhaustively actualized. It seems that we have to learn to re-experience the value and beauty of latency. Again, the I can't, implied in the unwillingness to fully spell out the meaning of something that cannot be forced into the open, an idea, a feeling, a motive, must not be understood as a denial of agency. On the contrary, the insistence to speak or make work in any other way about that which is neither readily understandable nor immediately useful is in itself a strong claim to agency. I can speak or make work about what I can't speak or make work about. While this is in a more general sense applies to any form of art or writing, it may have a special bearing on abstract work. The provocation of abstraction in thinking, as much as in painting or sculpture, for instance, lies precisely in this insistence on addressing and not addressing its subject in the very same instant. The capacity of abstract thought and work to invoke ideas in the most concise way is intrinsically linked to the possibility of exhaustive verification through positive facts. Abstract thought and work insists on latency of meaning, but not because it won't disclose its immediate meaning, but because it can't. If it could, it would lose its capacity to address the potential reality of all that is presently not given in actuality, i.e. all the possibilities that lie beyond those already actualized within the dominant mode of thinking, acting. I feel like that this is an incredible essay in this book, and so you can access it here, but it also speaks to all these theories and these ideas that we're always kind of dreaming up, you know, in a space that we are feeling can happen and can be actually actualized, but we just have to inhibit it and we have to move forward in some way that in ways that we don't even know that we have the capacity to bear or understand or wish up currently. So I think in going away, it's not necessarily about swallowing all this information. It's about thinking about what you need and what you can give to the future industry and the future of your practice. Also about your well-being and your community at home, your community, the family that you make. Those are the things that I think are important. And I think slowing down to kind of ramp up our thinking and our slow and have a greater awareness is the only thing that you can kind of take away.
Absolutely.
That's such a great kind of place to end on. Slowing down to ramp up, our thinking.
Awareness too, yeah.
Rochelle, did you want to add anything before we go to questions?
I mean, definitely in regards to awareness, I think that is so important. If anything, like this time has really taught us about awareness, not just spatially, but also in regards to how we think and the ways that we are and our habits and behaviors and things like that. So I think we don't really know what freedom looks like exactly, but I'd like us to start thinking about what freedom might mean to us personally, especially those who are like historically oppressed, Black and brown people, women, trans communities. Like I want people to think about what that looks like for them. And of course we are under this kind of umbrella of capitalism, so it can be hard to think about structures in a real like kind of optimistic sense. But I think once we start to find ways that can be practiced, then perhaps we can move forward to something in a kind of trial and error sort of way, I hope. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both for that.
Thank you.
That's been a brilliant conversation. Alicia, I just wondered if we had any questions.
We've got 2 questions. The first one is from Ellie. She said, have you addressed this slowness within your personal practice? Do you feel pressure to be making the most of this isolated time?
Do you mind if I go with that, Roch?
No, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, I think the question of slowness has been on my mind for years. As you guys all know, I'm bringing out a book called The Slow Grind, but it's also the what's centering on like fashion and the creative industries and fashion system, but also thinking it's about having a holistic conversation. And I feel as though slowness, as I said, like giving yourself the time to think or the time to feel and the time to kind of move through things, it allows you to think about how connected systems are, like how social care is connected to business industries and finance and all those type of things, and how can we as community makers kind of mobilize in those spaces if we don't understand how all those things impact our lives. So I feel like slowness, yeah, it's hard to adopt, man. Like I can't sit here and say that it's the easiest thing to commit to, but I have in my own life witnessed like just greater love for myself, greater love for things around me, and gratitude as well. And that's only happened when I kind of decided I'm not going to perform. And it's not like you don't have those thoughts anymore or those feelings, because it's also automatic, because you're within an industry that again is like hyper accelerated, right? So you feel as though you need to be doing what everyone else is doing, but it's constantly checking in with yourself and constantly reaffirming things to yourself and choosing what you have to kind of sign on to, you know? I think for both of us, we're in industries where you are criticized a lot and your work is criticized, and you have to decide what you're going to block out. You have to decide what you're going to listen to. And that only happens when you decide to live intentionally. Like when you don't, you just go with the wind, and then you find out that you're going to combust. So yeah, so I had to really start internalizing a slower way of living. And it wasn't always being slow, like not doing anything, because my rate of work might look different to somebody else. It might be really a lot to somebody else. So it's also not a game of comparison. You know, it's just about kind of refuting all these characteristics of capitalism. You know, comparison is the biggest stealer of joy, but comparison allows businesses to be competitive. Competitiveness is another big stealer of joy, but it allows businesses to strive to be on lists and all those type of things. But when you start deciding and start figuring out what matters to you, you can really internalize completely new ideals that help you see the world and yourself and most importantly with fresh eyes, and give the time and attention you need to your mental well-being, which is incredibly important.
Absolutely. So well said. I think we've had, I'm just giggling because we've had so many rants on the phone and like in person about like how frustrated we are with the occurrence and the kind of ways that this model, the fields and industry work, especially in this idea of like there can only be one type of thing. And I think for me, yeah, that it's really, I've really had to look at what feeds me, what nourishes me, and what I can nourish as well. There was this really great phrase that I think Okui from the talk with Tina Kemp said, which was what we have carried in, which carries us. What do you contribute that also feeds you? I think it's a circular thing, and it's looking at kind of cyclical structures. We have to think about what goes out and what comes in. But also I think once I removed myself like mentally from the kind of race, I just felt so relieved. Suddenly this like invisible burden was just lifted. But it wasn't invisible, it was totally internalized. But it what does that look like? There was no kind of tangible aspects or solid aspect that I could look at. But I knew that I was internalizing so much. And I just, once I stepped out of that, it just felt really, really great. So I think it takes a lot of kind of flipping the narrative, flipping your view of the industry, turning it upside down, looking at it from various perspectives can really help you to kind of widen what you've accepted, you know.
And bear in mind, this is daily, man. It's not like this once and it's a once.
Definitely not.
No, it's a process. Yeah.
And it fluctuates because there are some days, it's true. There are some days it's too much.
No, but I feel like for me it was a question of crisis because I had to really reevaluate what mattered to me. Else I would not be here today. I wouldn't see 27, and those are facts. So if I didn't actually think about what my life meant and what I'm living for, like, it's easy to just devalue yourself, you know.
Yeah,
for sure.
Great. What's the second question, Alicia?
It's from Deborah. She said, "Love to you both. What cultural practices of slowness have you been drawing upon or finding inspiration? I'm thinking about things like 9 nights/weeks, an extended and specified time for mourning and celebration that may not be present in Western culture."
What was the first part of that, sorry?
What cultural practices of slowness have you been drawing upon or finding inspirational?
That's a good question.
Georgina, this is you.
Again, I think, well, my family's Christian. I'm Christian. And again, affirmations. And actually just, I had to really think about my thought life. And I know that sounds like its own entity, but when you consider your thought life and how the power, for instance, of like a negative thought and how that creates like a muscle reflex in your brain, and essentially how that then creates a whole system in your brain of things that you relay to that one event, for instance. And it may have stemmed from me thinking about it in a Christian, through Christianity, but like now I'm doing so much reading on the mind and PTSD and trauma and those things, and it's all these things connect. The way that we think about things, the connections that we draw, and how do we reconnect and how do we flex new muscles in our brains. So I think practices of slowness that I've had to engage with and actively embed in my life are like simple things like affirmation. Like I had a huge problem with comparison at a stage in my life, and I had to get to the root of that. And it's even points like now when I think, when I'm not thinking brilliantly about myself, I have to think, what is the root of this? Like, is this my ego? Am I jealous? Like, and be honest about it, you know? Because when you're dealing with your mental health, there's no time to be embarrassed, you know? Like, there's no time for it. You have to just try and do the work. And I think Deborah's someone, hey Deborah, I love you too, who's someone who's great to speak to about these things as well, because she has a lot of rituals in her life as well, like just making her body butters and those things, which are super fab. I just think it is about radical care, and radical care with your mind is something that we do not explore. We just think our minds will go on the same way and they'll do themselves. No, your brain is like any other muscle. It needs to be exercised. And if you're not exercising it with the right things, you're not thinking about what you're putting in it, you're not thinking about what those things that are in it have, like the power and capacity they have or take, then you're letting it run wild, you know? So it's a lot about muscle management in my mind sense. Yeah. And that's slow, because it takes time.
It does take time, for sure. It does. I think, well, I was thinking about cultural ritual, but you touched on something about kind of honesty there, with being honest with yourself. And for me, coming from Jamaican family, like they'll just tell you straight up what it is, you know. And I mean, this isn't for everyone. I know every family is nuanced and stuff, but for me, like if there's an issue, my mum's just saying straight up, listen, what is it? And I think that is the kind of thing that I've tried to embed, and that's also something that not everybody has experienced. So I think whether you have or haven't, trying to build in this kind of respect for transparency with yourself and with those that you care about is really important. And it's not easy. It's something that I'm trying to do every day in a better way, and I'm trying to evaluate how what I say to people feels for me, and consider how that feels for them, but also to not run away from transparency or be afraid of it. So that's something that I can link to kind of where I come from, for sure.
Brilliant. We've got 2 more questions, I believe. Is that right? Are you guys happy to just... Let's do it.
Yep, so the next one is from Lydia. She said, do you often feel frustrated in your journey towards slowness? How do you combat it?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, I guess sometimes you think when you kind of decide to adopt a different way of living, you feel as though it's not enough. It's, you know, I think every which way, especially women, especially Black women, are being told they're not enough. And then when you try and do something that goes against the grain, it kind of further pushes that feeling and that notion. And that builds frustration. But I keep going back to defining myself for myself, because when I'm not in an article or I'm not doing an exhibition or any of those things, I'm going home to myself, right? So if I'm not comfortable with how I feel about myself, then none of this stuff is going to matter. And like both myself and Rochelle have been through those points where we would just burn out from producing.
Absolutely.
And I think the frustration of like not being where you feel like you should be isn't as bad as the frustration of feeling like you're not okay in yourself, you know? Like that is a symptom of capitalism ultimately. This is a symptom of the internalization of capitalism, me not feeling great. So whilst it's frustrating, I think you just have to take time, you know? And I'm not a patient person. Like, all my friends know this. And that serves me in some ways of my life where I'm not patient with the system and I'm not patient with like things getting done. But then other areas of my life, I'm not patient with myself. I'm not patient where I want to be, you know? So it's also like taking the wins where you can take the wins and understanding that everything else is a lesson. And I'm not here to be like an authoritative voice on anything at all. Like I can only talk on the things that I know, and that's about it. So I just think frustration, like everything, will pass. So
yeah, just knowing how to manage that. Great. Well, I just wanted to thank you both. I think it would be really great to come back in a few months or 6 months and just see where we're at, and kind of revisit and catch up on that. But thank you so much. I've learned a lot myself on this concept of slowness. As I said, I'm not there yet, but I just want to say
by day.
My parents, I could see them.
Oh, hi. Hi, Kaia's parents.
Thank you so much for joining. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.